So let's get started. So of course, as we just say, we're going to talk about GraphQL today, and what are for me like the essential innovation that you should be aware of when it comes to work with GraphQL and to take the most of it to get like the better stack and the better product for your companies. So small introduction that is not really necessary now, but Charly. I'm lead software engineer at Double. We are building a product for helping executive we are building a product to make delegation easier for executive by matching them with the best assistant, but also providing them tools like a web API, Chrome extension, and also mobile apps. And as I just say, I'm a big fan and user of GraphQL for 4 years now. I've been in a lot of side projects, ton of talks and articles around it, and working with it like professionally on different startups like for 3 years, if I can say. So before getting started and see a short history of GraphQL and all the progress that has been made and then the innovation in 2020, let's make sure that everybody is at the same level here in understanding what is GraphQL in 1 minute. So GraphQL is a language that allows you first to describe a schema. So if you compare it to REST, here you're gonna very describe what is the data with data types, your project, for example, and then you're gonna describe what are the queries that you can make to get the data from your API. So first, use the GraphQL language to define your data. Then you're gonna define a resolver. So example here in JavaScript. So it's a very, very simple and straightforward mapping between your types and the field of your type. So here, for example, query.project. Here we define how to get a project by name. And then using, again, the GraphQL language, you're going to see that GraphQL is helping you to define what the data, but also express query that are sent from the front end. So on the left, this is backend side. And on the right is going to be front end side. Describe how you want to get your data. And GraphQL had a lot of adoption and love from the front-end community because it's very straightforward to understand. As you can see here, it's very close to JSON. Even if it's not JSON, it's a GraphQL language. And so last step, you send this query, so basically in the payload of your post request to the GraphQL API, and you get JSON data straightforward. So very easy, very simple, and that's why GraphQL is so famous, if I can say, nowadays. So talking about GraphQL, the initial public release of GraphQL was in 2015. Even if it was developed and used internally at Facebook since 2012, the first release was at that date. So 5 years ago, actually. I think in the last week was the 5 years of GraphQL anniversary. So the first release were two main packages. The GraphQL packages, package on the Node.js side to build your GraphQL server, and the Relay GraphQL client on the front-end side, mostly working with React. So those two first packages were really here to help you getting started and build simple GraphQL API to get used to the technology. But at this time, it was pretty cumbersome, verbose to build GraphQL API. You had to use a lot of objects. It was not really the JavaScript way of doing, but still they had immediately a pretty good adoption. Because right the year after, the ecosystem was already awakening with library like GraphQL tool that was helping building GraphQL API faster with a more concise syntax that we're going to see right after. And then Apollo arrived also in the landscape of GraphQL with Apollo server that was helping you building like GraphQL API faster, and Apollo client, especially with React Apollo, that was taking the idea from Relay that were a bit complex, a bit too high level engineering, in quote, Facebook complex way of doing things, and bringing more like JavaScript community idea into the Relay client. And also GraphQL, the explorer and if you can say like kind of a debugger tool, super famous and still here nowadays. So in 2016, it was already way much easier, not even 1 year after the public release of GraphQL, to build API and to use them, thanks to Apollo, GraphQL tool, and the ongoing effort, of course, of Relay and GraphQL core team. Small intermission here before continuing on the history of GraphQL. of this introduction. So for me, as I just say, I've been doing GraphQL for 4 years now. And my first project on GraphQL was to build a GraphQL version of the Spotify API, because I had this side project when I wanted to get a lot of data from Spotify and build my own player, my build recommendation system. And for that, I needed to get a lot of data. So I built this first POC project that was helping getting all my data on Spotify. So here, as you can see, it's very straightforward in terms of GraphQL syntax to see that I'm getting all my playlists. You can read it, you understand exactly what you want, and what you get is very straightforward too. 2 years after, I already did like a lot of talks, articles, small articles, and working for 2 years in companies working on GraphQL. And I decided to write an article to answer a lot of questions that at that time were still very relevant. Like a lot of people in 2018 were saying that GraphQL was a very good tool to have better performance. It was just a faster way to do API, or it was the new version of REST. And basically, I was a bit annoyed of those questions because also they were not true. And Zoom. Okay. I don't know if I can zoom on that. Sorry. So I read this article that was giving a conclusion of the state of GraphQL in 2018. So first, in 2018, GraphQL was definitely the right technology, the right library to build smooth user experience, because you had a smaller payload over the request, you could build like optimistic UI. But also GraphQL was solving the data complexity issue on the front-end side, because thanks to the typed data and also like the kind of graph data, it was easier to build like complex cache system like Apollo did, like Relay did. Also, you had like a bit of type mutation that was like doing a bit of a validation of data, even if it's not real validation of data on the front-end side out of the box. And also it was solving the real issue that was still here like 2 years ago of having a lot of custom logic of getting data from many endpoints and crunching the data and maintaining it into like a Mobix tree, maybe library or custom Mobix cache, etc. So in 2018, GraphQL was mostly doing things for the front end and was doing it super well, improving our day-to-day. Also starting to doing a lot of thing. Also doing a lot of thing on the starting to do small things on the server side by Apollo introducing GraphQL for microservice orchestration with schema teaching that was allowing to have one GraphQL API that was composing all the GraphQL API hosted on different server. So let's sum up on GraphQL in 2018. Very strong library on the front-end side with Apollo and Relay, and especially Apollo bringing a lot of new concepts that were not part of the initial draft and definition of GraphQL, like schema stitching I just talked about. A very powerful cache on the client side using Observer and optimistic UI patterns. But also on the backend, in 2018, we had like AWS AppSync that was like released, Apollo Optics for monitoring, and Prisma for a simple GraphQL. Okay, I don't know if I can do bigger. It's the definition of my. Okay, no, I cannot zoom. Sorry, guys. Yeah, I cannot zoom. So there was a lot of things that evolved in the GraphQL ecosystem to help to have a faster and more robust development. But also, I think the most important is that in 2018, we had the first public GraphQL API released by big companies like GitHub and Shopify. And this was definitely a milestone. All this brought GraphQL to be awarded of the highest interest technology last year in the State of JS report. So what this interest from this huge interest from the JavaScript community and not only the front-end community brought to GraphQL in 2020. So GraphQL in 2020 is a lot. of different, it's a very rich ecosystem with a lot of different library, not only maintained by Facebook or Apollo, and a lot of different big actors. Of course, I'm not going to cover all of them right now, but still interesting to see all the things that arrive in 5 years. And also, hundred of big company using GraphQL to solve complex issue. And sorry, I'm reading the the chat at the same time, and I'm a bit confused. So okay, it's okay apparently. So hundred of company, big company, you're relying on GraphQL. For example, I know that PayPal is using GraphQL to make like the checkout experience smoother. Netflix is using GraphQL to do all the marketing and data, getting the marketing data and make like data crunching. From what I heard, Shopify is heavily migrating to GraphQL, and I work personally with Shopify API for 1.5 years, and it's such a better way of working for us. And of course, those are like big companies. There is thousands of startups that are using GraphQL nowadays. So in this presentation, I want to show you that both on the server and front-end side, GraphQL is much more than an efficient way of fetching data from the client side. This is a way that GraphQL got into this famous technology that is today, but it's doing way more than that nowadays. So we're going to see that in two parts. First, we're going to see the GraphQL innovation on the front-end side with very deep example, because this is a React Summit, and then quick overview of the biggest achievement and bridging the gap of GraphQL, bridging the gaps that GraphQL did on the server side. So let's get started with to see that GraphQL nowadays is a really, really reliable, powerful, and very easy to use solution to do state management with React. So nowadays, if you start an application with React and you want to do state management, you're gonna have like 4 main actors or 4 main solutions that most companies are going to use. If you have a very small app or not that much state to maintain or very simple state to maintain, you can use context API. I'm not doing that, but you can do it. Or you can use like the good old Redux because it's still working. You can use Mobix, or you can use the new Recall. So the definition of GraphQL, the tagline of GraphQL is that GraphQL is a data inquiry manipulation language for API. But Apollo has a different view on that. Apollo is more into GraphQL is a data query manipulation language for data, not only for API. So if you take a look at Apollo client, so the Apollo GraphQL client mission, the version 1 and 2 of the Apollo client, the goal of those versions was to build the best GraphQL client, which it did because most people use Apollo nowadays. Since the version 3, the new goal of the Apollo client GraphQL library is to have a library for interacting with data with client-side data graph, meaning that Apollo is helping us interacting with data on the client side, not only remote data, but also local data, which means that we can do local state management with GraphQL. So we're going to start with a very simple local state example, very simple, and then I'm gonna show you why I did in my current company as a complex state management, because there is plenty of example of simple local states, like doing like a to-do list, doing very simple action, but you can go pretty far actually nowadays with Apollo 3 for local state management. So for example, we want to have a flag, which is dark mode, that we want to keep as an application state, so available for all components, whatever the depth of the components, and also store it as local in the local storage. So our components are gonna do a GraphQL query using Apollo, doing use query. And here you can see that we have this directive that Apollo is providing that indicate to Apollo that this value is stored locally. It's not a value that we have to fetch from the API. So this app client is saying to Apollo that the dark mode field, sorry, I'm distracted by the chat, so I'm gonna hide it for now. that the dark mode query is a local one. So Apollo is not going to try to resolve it on the API. It's going to try to look in the cache for this value. And what you can do, since Apollo 3 is use type policy. So sorry if it's, okay, let's do that if it's better. Okay, so here you have a type policy. In this, you're going to provide it to the Apollo cache in-memory cache as an argument, And what we do is with type policy that we can override how Apollo is reading data from the cache. So we can provide read function that's going to be called before calling data. It's going to be called instead of getting the data from the cache directly. And what we're going to do here is that, okay, we're going to have our key for local storage, and we're going to make a reactive var. So reactive var is a new feature of Apollo 3 that allows to create a variable that's going to be based on observable. So here we create a dark mode variable that's going to store our dark mode value. We initialize the value of the dark mode with the local storage, otherwise we fall back to false. And we get this variable, which is a function. So if you call this variable, this reactive variable, without arguments, you get the current value. If you call it with arguments, you update the value. So here, basically, to sum up very fast, we declare a variable that's going to keep our data in memory, or dark mode flag in memory. And we also provide to Apollo the way to resolve the data for the dark mode query. So, okay, it sounds okay. So let's move forward. So interesting thing with reactive variable and this type policy is that if I call the reactive variable, as I say, so here I say, okay, I want to put dark mode to true. I call the variable to update the value. The thing is that if the value gets everywhere that a reactive variable is used into a read function, every time the reactive variable is going to be updated, the query is going to be updated also. So this is very, very powerful because you can do pretty crazy thing in terms of local management. You can use GraphQL to get the data, and then you can use reactive variable to update the current, all the GraphQL query that depends on it. If you want to, my advice would be like, instead of using the reactive variable everywhere in your app, it's better to wrap them in custom hooks. So here's like a use update dark mode that takes like a value. And this is a way, for example, I'm working in my current company. We wrap every use of the reactive variable into hooks, so we can rename it, we can add option, etc., etc. So this was a very simple example of how to use local state, Apollo client for local state. Let's see now a more advanced example where I'm going to be more in detail on how it works behind under the hood. So in my current company, we have a to-do list. So this is a to-do list, and so the to-do list item, like the to-dos, come from the remote GraphQL API, which is a normal, very simple use case. We just have a query, we use the use query hook, and we get the data, and we display the data in all the interaction. The small thing that we use here is that when you create a new to-do on our application, the new to-do, so right now, is local. It is not created directly on the server. It is created after having some action, explicit action on it. So we have to keep this local to-do, this draft in memory, while we have like to-dos that come from the API. So the thing that we did is that we leverage Apollo 3, all the feature like type policy, reactive variable, to make sure that the components don't have the knowledge of that the data is coming from remote or local. For this component, all the to-dos are to-dos, and it doesn't have to do like two queries, merge the data, etc., etc., etc. So totally transparent at the component level. So I'm gonna explain to you how this is working, since it's a quite advanced example of state management with Apollo. So again, type policy is a feature of Apollo that allows you to define read function that you write that's going to say how to get the data. So it's a proxy of the Apollo cache that then pass the data to the hook. So what we did is that here you have the query that we use to display the to-do list. So it gets like the topic list, pagination, and item with a fragment. So what we did is that we said, okay, so we want to define a type policy that's going to override how we read the data for this query. And when we try to get data from this query, we're going to take a look if there is a draft in our reactive variable. So this is a reactive variable. And if there is a draft, we're going to add it at the top of the list. Otherwise, we just return what is in the cache. So with type policy, we just update on the fly what's the data that's going to be sent to the hook without updating the cache. The cache is still having like the local data, the remote data, and we don't have to have like a very strange cache. The cache is still normalized. So of course, if the component is getting all the to-do merge without any difference between like remote and local one, like draft and non-draft, how can we have like different visual treatment? So in order to solve that, we can also add local field to remote type. So the to-do is a type that is provided by the API, but Apollo allows us to add property to existing type that are local. So here, for example, in our type definition on the client side, we're going to add that isDraft is a property that we add on to-do that has to be read from the client. And as we see, we saw like already 2 times on the previous slide, we are going to define a type policy that's going to say, okay, to-do.isDraft. We're going to call the helper to know if the current ID, so the current record that we try to read for, is a draft or not. So isDraft is never going to be sent to the API. It's going to be resolved locally by Apollo using this helper that behind the scene is relying on the reactive variable that contain all the drafts, that contain the current draft in memory. So this is how it works, basically. So if I have to sum up, we have this list that have one GraphQL query that get both remote to-do and the draft. The draft has all the to-do have a remote, a local property that is called isDraft. That's going to be false for all the to-do that are fetched from remote, and true for the to-do that is local, that is a draft. This local to-do is in a reactive variable. So when we want to create a new draft, we just assign a to-do object to the reactive variable. And since updating a reactive variable also updates all the query that rely on this reactive variable, it updates the UI. So it sounds very complicated. Sometimes there is a lot of concept, but if you look at the Apollo documentation, you will see that it's very easy and you can provide a very, very, very good developer experience to your team, because here all the data logic is on the Apollo configuration, and at the component level, you deal with data. You don't deal with crunching the data, doing condition depending on if you have to fetch it from Mobix and GraphQL, etc. So it makes more maintainable code. So to sum up on local state management, I will answer the question during the Q&A because maybe there is some questions since I'm going a bit fast on that. GraphQL nowadays is no longer just like a hipster, like kind of flaky, fun example of doing state management. It's really reliable as Mobix because, for example, state is managed by Apollo Cache that we have been using for more than 4 years now. That is like highly reliable, super performant. You can have computed value, like in Mobix, using type policy, because type policy are here to update on the fly data that you read from the cache. You can have action in the Mobix way, because you can have reactive variable that's going to update the type policy, but you can also write directly in the cache. And you can react to any update on the cache, because all Apollo query are observable query, and also reactive variable update the observable query when updated. And all this is benefiting of the Apollo client dev tool. So you can actually inspect both your remote data and local data using Apollo client dev tool. So I went pretty fast on that. Sorry for people that never used Apollo. I will be able to answer the question during the Q&A. I'm moving to another example that is way more simpler and already super well known, but I think it's super important that if you want really to have a very modern and solid, consistent, reliable front-end stack, you should definitely use this feature of that GraphQL is bringing through the community. So GraphQL full stack type safety. So my always regret since 4 years, almost 5 now, is that GraphQL introspection is an awesome feature that was really underrated and underused by the community. So what is GraphQL introspection? GraphQL introspection is the ability to send a specific query that starts with underscore underscore schema that allows you, so you send this query through GraphQL API and you get as an answer a description of your schema. So while most of the time you do query to get data, and here you can do query to GraphQL API and to the GraphQL API to get like the shape of your data dynamically when it's enabled. So this is very powerful. And since GraphQL and TypeScript has been rising in popularity almost at the same time, a lot of solutions arrived combining GraphQL and TypeScript and providing full stack type safety. One of the most well-known and more stable is GraphQL Code Generator. So GraphQL Code Generator is a library that from the GraphQL API, GraphQL schema, generate for you the TypeScript type definition, which is already what Apollo was doing with Apollo CodeGen, but it's way easier to configure and there is way more feature and plugin with GraphQL Code Generator. It generates for you also the React Apollo hooks code definition. And also it's compatible with other clients like URQL and generate also types for Flow, Java, Kotlin, and Swift. So let's see an example. Here I'm on my production project, my current company. We have this mutation to create a project. So I'm running Apollo CodeGen, which is gonna create for me a big file. So as you can see, like 7,000 because we have a lot of mutation and query everywhere. Generate for me the code, also the TypeScript type, and it supports fragments. And on the left, you're gonna see that I'm gonna use directly this hook generated by GraphQL CodeGen, and I'm gonna have like a, okay, so I can do pause here. So I'm gonna have like a typed hook directly using the GraphQL introspection of my query. And every time my API is gonna change, it's gonna update also all the hooks of my application, type definition, break everything, but at least I will never, or I will have way fewer error on the client side about like API change or data compliance, if I can say. So this is great, but as you can see, it can generate a lot of different hooks, and maybe you don't want to end up with 200 or maybe like, yeah, maybe 100, 200 hooks, custom hooks in your application just to fetch data. So a new feature that just has been released by GraphQL CodeGen is the type document node, which is super interesting. So I have this query that gives me the rates for a currency. I'm going to run GraphQL CodeGen, which is just an npm script. So this is the configuration. As you can see, it's very easy. You provide the schema if you have like a local schema for local state. You provide the document. So you're going to list all the query you want to do in your application. And it generates for you a file that's going to contain like the TypeScript definition, TypeScript definition. There's also the type document node. So very straightforward, very easy to. Okay, there is issue with the code. I'm sorry. This is the last example with code. Okay. Oh yeah, I can zoom. Okay, sorry. So here, for example, you're gonna see that I'm gonna import the generated document. So this is a GraphQL document in a variable from the generated file. I'm gonna be able to use it. And I'm gonna use it with use query. And the thing that here you can see, I don't have to provide like a generic type to use query like you can maybe do with Apollo CodeGen. I'm just providing the document and I have like automatic type for me, type checking. Yeah, so there is autocomplete, etc. So in terms of developer experience, this new feature, I found it like very smart, very easy to maintain, and avoid of having like hundred of hooks in your application, which is I think that in all production application right now at Double, we maybe have like, I mean, we have 7,000 line of generated code just for GraphQL hooks. So that's a lot of hooks. So The good thing with GraphQL is that now we have a cheap to maintain, best-in-class TypeScript type linked to our hook in our front end. And I do think that it's a very, very, very good thing to have. It was very hard to do or to maintain with Apollo like 2 years ago, but right now we have like tools that generate everything for us with different versions. You can either choose to generate only TypeScript types, you can choose the naming convention, you can generate hooks, or you can now generate typed GraphQL document. So yeah, I found it pretty amazing. Okay, so now let's take a look. We saw some what I think being like the essential thing to use nowadays in front end on React application on top of using just Apollo or any other client for doing GraphQL. Let's now see a bit like what are the things that are being evolving this year, especially this year, very fast on the server side. So GraphQL is definitely bridging the gaps on server side. What does it mean? In the last, if I can say 3 years, there was three main solutions when it comes to develop GraphQL API. You could either use Apollo with Apollo Server, Apollo Schema Stitching, and Federation even, but you had to write everything by yourself, which can be sometimes a bit cumbersome because you are doing a lot of mapping, performance issues, super hard to solve, etc., etc. Or you could use either Prisma, that is more like GraphQL as a service, that recently pivoted to something different that also allows you to use Prisma in your GraphQL API. But initially, Prisma was really like a GraphQL as a service. You want to build like in a no-code experience your GraphQL API, and it works. But it was still a very, very simple use case. Very like having almost like CRUD GraphQL, which is a bit like not what you want to do with GraphQL, which is meant to be used to not having CRUD operation on front end. And then you have the big and awesome AWS AppSync, which even today you can do almost anything with it. It's very powerful. It's like leveraging the AWS ecosystem by using GraphQL. But the issue, and I won't talk about AWS in the next slide, because for me, like AWS is AWS. You sometimes need like just a PhD to start using it. There is a lot of things, a lot of concepts, but it's for me definitely the more complete solution right now, but not the best solution for the JavaScript ecosystem in terms of simplicity and getting started. So we're going to ask yourself two questions regarding GraphQL on the server side right now. So between Apollo and Prisma, what about building more complex API without having to write everything by yourself? So actually, a team answered this question and arrived with a very, very good solution. And this team is Ashura. So Ashura is a service, is a tool, and also like kind of a database, if I can say, that's is doing very arrived like maybe a bit more than a year ago with a very, very interesting concept of translating GraphQL query into SQL query. So taking your GraphQL and changing it into the SQL equivalent, making removing the need to write the resolver by hand when you have like simple use case, and also providing like super fast execution and immediate like support for subscription. So this is great. Now we have like very fast GraphQL database that you can use with existing Postgres database. So no more migration cost for data for GraphQL. But I mean, in terms of going to production and solving this, choosing between Apollo and Prisma thing, you have to have something that helps you to deal with custom logic, more advanced logic than just getting data from a database. And this is where comes like this new feature from Ashura that is called Action. And basically, you can have your custom logic on specific fields or specific queries of your GraphQL graph being linked to Action. And Action is just like calling an external service to resolve custom business logic. So maybe like compute a token. The token is not going to be in your Postgres database. You need like to generate it from a external API. So you're going to have Action either before calling the database or after getting the data from the database. So you can do custom business logic, you can do data validation, and data arrangement and transformation. Of course, by doing action, you are losing a bit of the performance of the being directly plugged to Postgres, but still, I found it pretty awesome to have this kind of thing nowadays, thanks to GraphQL and the typed schema. So if we take a look at Ashura, Ashura also brings ACL support. So you can control which field of your schema is accessible for certain type of user very easily. You can even do it without any coding. You have authentication authorization using GWT, which is like super well known and widely used nowadays. You can have remote schema. So you can also say, oh, my Ashura database is calling my is using my Postgres, but I want also to use on the same Ashura endpoint my existing GraphQL API and plug it on it using schema teaching from Apollo. So it supports that. You have subscription on Postgres. When you use it on Postgres, so they make an article when they talk about the fact they have like supporting like 1 million row update per second, which is like awesome. You can have action. You can trigger webhooks on database event. And a bonus, you can use Ashura Cloud on most cloud provider. And now you have also one-click install on Heroku and AWS. So yeah, Ashura is not a database. It's more like doing GraphQL over existing database. It's more like a GraphQL to SQL. It's a very simplistic explanation. It's way more powerful than that, as you can see, but it's not a database. Last question we want to answer is like, okay, GraphQL is great, but one of the issues is that also how to do GraphQL when you have all the REST API, you cannot migrate, and you want to do GraphQL with external services. You cannot like change because they are external services. So the answer to that is GraphQL Mesh. So GraphQL Mesh is leveraging the fact that most API can have like a Swagger or Open API definition. So it's a file that describes what your REST API is doing. And there is a lot of tools that can help you to generate a Swagger file. So it's kind of a schema of your REST API. And then GraphQL Mesh is using those definitions. So gRPC, Swagger, OpenAPI to generate on the fly GraphQL API from existing non-GraphQL API. So even like directly database, gRPC API, OpenAPI, REST API. So earlier I was talking about the Spotify GraphQL project I had. This is exactly the thing I wish I had GraphQL Mesh like 4 years ago, because it took me a very long time to rewrite everything, to rewrite the schema, to get all from the doc from Spotify, to get it running, to host it, etc., etc., etc. So with GraphQL Mesh, I've been able this week to redo like this Spotify GraphQL API in 5 minutes. For that, I just found a Swagger definition of the Spotify API. I created a mesh configuration file where just providing the URL of the Swagger definition. And in 5 minutes, I had a GraphQL running, allowing me to do GraphQL query over the production available GraphQL API. Spotify REST API. So GraphQL allows you to proxy, to use GraphQL Mesh is allowing you to GraphQL over existing API that does not support GraphQL. You can also do schema transformation. You can update the schema that has been generated. You can do resolver composition. So you can also update the data and change the data, a bit like Apollo type policy. You can do caching, and you can generate an SDK from that. So one thing here, GraphQL Mesh is not aimed to create like production public API because it does not provide authorization, authentication, etc. I will have to skip some slides in the end because I'm late. So let's sum up on GraphQL in 2020. So the great thing, I think, is that GraphQL in 2020 is not only anymore a Facebook and Apollo technology. There is also other actors, big actors like the Guild that is maintaining GraphQL Mesh, GraphQL Cogenerator. There is Ashura. There is the dgraph GraphQL database, and so many more individual contributors. And GraphQL in 2020 is beyond fetching data from the client side because it provides better front-end experience, like the full stack type safety. You can have easier way to build complex GraphQL API with Ashura. You have fast GraphQL database for simple use case like Ashura or over Postgres, and also dgraph. And you can use GraphQL as a universal data language over existing API with GraphQL Mesh, but also to manage data on your state with Apollo. We have to skip this one because I'm super late.
1 minute left.
Okay, 1 minute left. So let's talk on this one. So let's talk a bit about like the future of GraphQL. Of course, I have no clue about what is really going to happen because I'm not working at Apollo or either Facebook. But for me, what I would love to see is a better support of subscription. I think one of the biggest weakness of GraphQL nowadays is the lack of having more advanced real-time capability because Apollo Federation is breaking subscription, and also the defer in live directive that has been on discussion for years are still not working in production. Also, I think there is room for improvement for a better caching, and we are lacking of more stable and more powerful client, mobile client for Swift and Android. So there was a lot of information. We maybe have a lot of questions during the QA. You can find the slide already now on my notice profile. Don't hesitate to follow me on Twitter because I'm going to write small articles to deep dive into all those technology and how to use them in some use case, etc. So I'm going to post that on Twitter, and you can also find. So I saw a lot of people talking about like what could be good resources to start with GraphQL. I've wrote some articles for LogRocket recently on the LogRocket blog, and I have also a lot of resources for people that start in TypeScript on my Medium. But if you have any question, don't hesitate to ask me on Twitter and during the QA. Thank you very much. Charlie? Yeah, you're here. Okay. You're muted. You're muted, Charlie.
Sorry, thank you. Okay, thank you for your speech. It was really interesting. I can see a lot of warm feedbacks right here at the YouTube channel.